Welcome to a video where we're going to be going over the basics of data assets and especially how to apply them to something like a weapon system. So more than just doing a tutorial on this, I want to kind of go through the workflow and mainly my thought process of why I do it this way and how I go about thinking about it, because that's, I feel like, much more important than simply a tutorial. That way, this system, you can use it for anything else from basic items to a card game, or even developing the weapon system further. That's what I'm going to be showcasing today. We're going to go over this in kind of two parts. The first part will be, I'm going to be explaining more or less how data assets work and why I prefer using them over data tables, because that tends to be a discussion that pops up when you talk about data assets. And then we're going to be implementing a very basic weapon system with the data assets so that you can kind of see the workflow for that topic. So I'm going to be doing this in Unreal Engine 5.1. I don't believe there's going to be much difference as long as you're using Unreal Engine 5. I think any version is okay. We're going to be using the first person. That way we can easily work with the weapon component that already exists to apply our data assets. But we'll get back to that in a second. So let's go and create the project. So in my case, I'll just call it data asset weapons, and I'll see you once it's loaded. So now that the project is loaded, let's talk about data assets. So data assets are, in simple terms, they're a container for information. As the name suggests, data asset, they store data. That's what they're used for. So the main thing to know about data assets and the main way to treat them is you need to treat them as read-only. And there's a few reasons for this. So the first thing to note is that they are not actually set to read only. And what that means is that anywhere in the blueprint, if you reference back to a data asset, you can modify it. That is not a problem. You can do that. But the risk of that is if ever you have two versions of that same, let's say, item, let's say we make a sword and a sword has a durability. If you were to use the data asset as you would use any actor, if you were to make this system with actors, then the problem with this is that the data assets information is replicated across all versions or references to that object or to that data asset, let's say. So that means if ever you were to reduce the durability of one weapon, any subsequent other weapon using the same data asset would find itself in the situation where its durability would change as well. So that's the reason why when working with data assets, we consider them read-only, because any changes to them are applied to any other item that is referenced in it. And that doesn't matter how it is instanced, it will always do this. That's how it works. So that's why it's best to treat them as read-only. As for why we are, or at least as for why I prefer using data assets over data tables, to my knowledge, and you can read up on this more if you're interested, but data assets, from my research and from my experience, tend to be more stable when working with structures and other more complicated variables, especially the structure part, where if in a data table you apply a structure, as that's how it's intended to be used, it is very risky to modify the structure itself outside of the data table. As if, for instance, let's say you have a name and let's say a description. If you want to add or modify the default value of that structure, it might quite literally crash your project or even brick the project, meaning you can't even run it anymore. That can happen when working with data tables, especially as they get larger, the likelihood of this happening increases. So it is the main reason why I work with data assets. And one of the main reasons I feel people do not work with data assets and still try data table is, or still use data tables, is because of the format, and that it's easier to write in a data table than it is to write in a data asset. Because in the data asset, you have to open them one by one and you have to go through every one to make modifications as you go down. But recently I discovered, and this is very useful for you if that is the reason you want to stick with data tables, is there are ways to actually display data assets as a form of data table, which allows it to be modified a lot easier than if you were to be in a data table as well, but obviously better than if you were going one object at a time. And so how that works is I will now show you a quick example right here. So I just went ahead and made a very quick data asset, and you don't have to recreate this. We'll be doing it in a few minutes. And in this data asset, we simply have a name and a durability. So for both of these, right here, we have the axe and the sword, and I've given them a name and a durability. And so here we have 10 for the sword. And as the major reason why I use data tables is we could change this all from one location, and it could get annoying every time to have to open it up again here. So the solution to that is to use what's called the bulk edit properties. And so to do that, you want to select any data asset you want to work on, right click and select asset actions and bulk edit via property matrix. So select this and it will open this window. And so you have here the two objects written here. So it'll be 3, 4, however many you have. And you can see here we have two windows or two tabs. Display shows us the information we want to display on the window. So by clicking the pin here, we can say, well, we want to see the name and the durability as well. Now, one thing to note, on this table, you can also modify here. That's not true for every variable type, as float we cannot, even if it shows it selected, we can't change the number. But we can simply do that on the side like you would in a normal data table by simply selecting this here. Now, when selecting, if you select two lines, because you can, it'll have multiple values, so you can bulk and change twice. For instance, if I put, for instance, 15 here, it'll change 15 for both of these. Now, if you want to change it individually, we just select the axe, and we can change just one of them. So we select here, we say, well, we don't want it to be axe now, we want it to be hatchet. Not a hatchet, but just hatchet. And so that way now, this has changed the name. The data asset itself is still called axe, so that doesn't change. If we go back here, we can see it's still there, but the name itself has changed right here, the variable. And so this can be done for as many as you need. If ever you don't want to modify them anymore, that's fine, you just hide it, it's not necessary. One thing to note about this though, is that you don't want to be having this open and at the same time making modifications to your data asset, because if you do that, it will crash the project because it can't really handle when this here changes while this is still open. So now we just want to do Control S to save it. We can close them and we can go to axe and it still is written hatchet 15, but sword is also 15 because we told them to be the same. So that's how you can manage multiple data assets, and that's mainly for those who were doubting to use data assets because of the format that allows it for easy use with data tables. Okay, so now that we've explained that, let's quickly go over how this kind of system would work. So I'm going to give a very basic example, and this is going to be a card game. If you think of any card game, data assets are the most likely solution to achieve that goal. So let's take the example of a Hearthstone card. So if we take the example of a Hearthstone card, for the example of a Hearthstone card, at least a simple one, obviously the more complex it gets, the more information you need in your data asset. But for a simple card, we have, let's say we have the mana cost, we have the name, we have the image, we have a description, we have the attacking power or attack damage, whatever you want to call it. We have the health, and we can also add a type or more details, for instance, the background of the card or any other kind of thing you want to add. But in the case of Hearthstone or a basic card, that is what you would have. Now, the data asset alone doesn't do this. The data asset alone isn't an instanced object, and it doesn't actually have a physical appearance. So in every single case when you work with data assets, you're always going to have an extra actor, an extra widget that will interpret the information from your data asset and transfer it onto the screen so that the player can interact with it. So in this case, in our case, will be, for instance, in our example, weapons will have, let's say, a durability, or we can talk about ammunition. It's the same situation there. Weapons in our data asset will have a max ammo, or they will have a magazine size, or a weapon will have a max durability. But in the actual weapon actor itself, the one that the player holds, or the component in our case, what we'll be doing, it needs to have that information from the data asset, but it also needs to have, for instance, the local variable, which will change. And that's so that we don't ever modify the data asset itself, because it's only this specific actor that will be changing. So that's the kind of process you want to think about when you do this system. One of the advantages of data assets, which it has over tables, is the fact that we can actually make child objects of it, which doesn't work in the case of structures, which are the main basis for the data tables. So with that in mind, you could have a very basic system with nothing like, for instance, just the name of an actor for the base class, and then slowly build up and branch out your different systems. Usually what I like to do is, for my weapon systems, I would have a base class that has, for instance, a name and a description, and then I would have a secondary class or two child classes, one for melee weapons and one for ranged weapons. As that information will not be the same, and instead of having it all in one actor or in one data asset, we have it split up so that it's easier to handle later. And obviously the same thing will be true for our actors. We'll do the same trick on the other side. We'll kind of mirror the process so that they all have, each data asset has its linked actor. So with all that said and done, let's get into actually making an example and showing you kind of walking you through the process of doing this on your own. And hopefully it's clear enough that you'll be able to do it with any other idea that you want to make. So let's do that. So I'm going to get rid of my data assets here that I just made. So we're going to get rid of those. We're just going to make a new folder to keep things organized. We'll just call it data assets. We'll call it maybe data asset practice. And so in here, we'll have a folder for the data asset themselves. So inside of the data asset, we're going to start here. This is going to be the basis of it. We are going to make our data asset. To make a data asset, before you'd have to go through C++, but here we can just go into our blueprints. And we want to open our all classes, and we're going to look for primary data asset. And so this is the one we want to use right here, primary data asset. So make sure not the data asset itself, because you can't actually create that. You want to use the primary one. So we're going to select it, and we'll call it data asset example, or maybe we'll call it base. And so in this data asset base, once we open it up, we're going to keep it very, very simple. As we mentioned, we're going to be constructing it as it goes, and we're going to start off with something very simple. We're going to have a name, which is going to be of type text. Then we're going to have a description for our weapon right here, which will also be text. And now any weapon, be it melee, be it ranged, be it whatever you want, it will always have name description. So we don't have to bother there. We can now close this. That's all we need to do. Now, if you want to be 100% safe here, something that we can do to ensure you don't modify the values here, you want to make sure you could check these to put read only. You don't have to, but it's safer if you're unsure and you worry that you might change it. So now with our base class, we want to actually make, or our base data asset, we want to create a child, and let's say for the ranged weapon. So we're going to say data asset, and we'll underscore ranged. And so for ranged weapons, and obviously this is going to be a very basic example, we want to add the information that we need. So to check what we already have in the past, because this is a child, we can click on the gear here and open and select show inherited variables. Select that, and we have our name description, and that's all we have. So we want to add to that now. We want to add information that is necessary for a ranged weapon. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to make one for the range. We want to know how far we can actually shoot our weapon. So we have a range. We want to know how much, let's say, actually that's a mistake I made. We can actually have this be, let's say, our fire rate. We can add the ammo, and we can add the max ammo. So maximum ammo is how much we have in the pocket, and ammo, let's rename this to magazine. There we go. So we have these 4 floats now, and one extra thing we can actually add back in our name and description, because we're specifically talking about weapons here, we could just add simply in here damage as a float. As damage is going to be for both factors, it won't matter. So we just add damage, float, compile, save, and it'll appear right here as well. So now we have our ranged. Now for the melee, to be fair, in our case, right here, it doesn't really matter because I'm giving an example, but usually for some of this stuff, you could keep it identical. But in our case, we'll try and split it just to show. So we can either create a child blueprint class from the base, or we can just simply duplicate the ranged, and we'll do that and call it melee. And so in the melee, we have the same stuff because we just copied it. We want to get rid of ammo because we don't have any ammo. We can get rid of obviously both of them. We want to keep fire rate. Normally we would have it differently, but we'll keep it simple. Fire rate just means how often we can hit. And for the range, we'll keep it as well because we want to have some. Well, actually, you know what? For range, we won't do that. We'll keep it set. We won't do range there. What we'll do instead is we will add a static mesh because we want to know what it looks like. So we're going to select static mesh, and that's going to be the appearance of the weapon. So in the case of our ranged weapon, we're actually going to do something as well. We're going to add a texture. And so the reason we want to do a texture is just because we're going to be using the same weapon as here. We're just going to be modifying the first person setup we already have, so we don't bother with making a whole new system just to showcase how the data assets work. So we're just going to have a texture. This is going to be 2D texture, I believe. Or you know what? Material is probably better. We'll rename that so we want it to be a material. So we'll just call this weapon material. There we go. So compile and save. And so for the melee, we want a static mesh instead. So we will get static mesh and just looking for a basic static mesh. Now, it is better to refer to static meshes as, or any kind of object as a soft reference, as otherwise you'll end up loading it when it's not necessary, because that's just how the data assets work. So it's better to use soft references whenever using data assets. So we'll select the soft object reference, and I'll show you how to load it once we get into the project, once we get to the actual actors itself anyway. So now we have our ranged, we have our base, and we have our melee. So we can close these unless we want to make any more modifications, which we don't, because this will be just fine for what we need. So now with these, we want to right click, and we're going to get in miscellaneous our data asset. So right here. So select it, and we're going to be looking for whichever one we want. Now, one thing to note is we don't actually want to do anything with our base class. Our base class doesn't do anything by itself. It shouldn't, because it doesn't have the information to do anything. So to avoid it appearing like that, we can make it so that it is not visible in these selections. And to do that, we need to open our class settings right here. And in the advanced, we can tell it to be generated as an abstract class. Now, what that means is normally, if we now go and right click, look for our data assets in miscellaneous, right here, we no longer have the data asset base because it's no longer capable of being instanced or used as a data asset. So we're going to start by making a ranged weapon here. So select it, and we'll just call this data asset, we'll call it slow, because we're going to be making it have a very low fire rate, so it takes a lot of time to shoot each bullet. So right now in our range, we're just going to put something like 1000. This is going to be used for the line trace once we need it. This is going to be used for the line trace once we start working on the actor. For the fire rate, we'll put something like 1, and I think fire rate isn't the right term. It should be interval between bullets, but fire rate is clear enough. You'll probably understand. Magazine, we'll put 15 bullets, and we will say the max is something like 150. Now, we're not going to go through making a widget for this because that would take extra time. It's not very necessary. For the material, we will just put any material that we can find. It doesn't matter. We'll just put the orange one. For the name, we will say slow weapon. And for the description, we'll just say this weapon fires slowly. The damage will be, let's say, 20 per bullet. Now, as such, it doesn't do anything. This is just for showcasing, because this weapon doesn't really deal any damage specifically, but we'll just set it up like that anyway. So now what we want to do is we want to make our melee weapon. So for the melee weapon, we want to right click. We're going to look once again in miscellaneous, data assets, and we're going to select melee. So say DA, just call melee, select it, and we can open this up. Now fire rate we'll leave at like 0.5. And for the static mesh, we'll use, do we have anything about the right shape? Not really. Maybe this rotation handler will work somewhat for what we want to do. So for the name, we'll call it, let's just call it a sword. It's not a sword, but this is definitely a sword. So for damage, we'll say 20, because its range is a lot shorter. It'll be the range of the actual static mesh itself. And we can close both of these. Now we'll just rename this to sword. Now let's just see if this works as well. If we right click, we can do our bulk edit again. It's just been the wrong screen for me. Now the difference here is that it won't allow us to do anything normally, or at least this won't work as well, very simply because, well, they don't inherit from the same class. So unless we're selecting a specific one, so if we have both, it won't actually allow us to showcase both. So I'm not sure the results. If we do this for the description, it works because they're the same. But if we show the static mesh here, it doesn't appear here. So now if I select our sword, we can show the rest, but they'll appear separately. So that's something to note. Obviously they don't use the same class, but we can still display them next to each other. So close that, still works, no problem. Next, what we want to do is we want to implement this so that it works with what we currently have. So normally what we would do here is we would have to create our own class and set that all up. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to use the first person weapon that already exists. So what that means is we won't be using the sword, because the sword would require making an entire new blueprint and setting up a whole new system with the player character. That is not really what this is about. It's more about showcasing the data assets. So we're just going to build on the, I think I just renamed the wrong weapon, didn't I? Yes, this should be slow, and the melee should be renamed to sword. So we're just going to be working mainly on the ranged weapons, just that it works with this. So just to showcase this difference, for instance, we will add a function or add. So to showcase this, we're going to get into our actual data asset. Now, just to make it easier, we're going to make a duplicate to this, which we will call fast, which unlike slow will shoot very, very fast instead. So we're going to put this to something like 10. We'll lower that, but we will lower the fire rate to 0.2. So now we have a fast weapon instead, and this weapon fires quickly. We'll change the color so that way it's clear that we're using a different weapon. And for the rest, we will leave it the same. Doesn't matter too much. So what we want to do here is now we want to open first our pickup rifle. Because for the pickup rifle, we need to determine which rifle we are talking about. So one thing to note is we still have our inherited variables. So that's why we have some extra stuff here that you probably don't see. We can just close that. We don't need it anymore. So this is going to be the overlap. So one thing we want to do first is we're going to get our event begin play, and we're going to be changing the weapon or the pickup based on which data asset we selected. Now, when using data assets like this, just like how I mentioned we don't want to have them referencing anything as a hard reference, the same thing is true in the opposite, because we don't want to load it once this blueprint loads. We want to load it at the specific moment we want to use it. So in our case, it is event begin play, so that doesn't matter, but usually that's the workflow you want to follow. So right here, we're going to add data assets like this, and we're going to be selecting data assets, and I believe the name we put will select base. That way, if ever you want to change it to melee, even though we won't be doing that, you can do that. So we want to select a soft class reference here, I believe. And if we compile, we can actually go and select, no, sorry, I did that wrong. We don't want the class. We want to select the soft object, sorry. So select base, soft object, compile, and now we can select any one of the three we made. So it doesn't matter if it's the ranged or the melee, it doesn't matter. So normally, worth noting here, we would actually separate this because we would have a pickup melee and a pickup range, but we'll just stick with this here. So with this in mind, we want to get our data asset, which is a soft reference, meaning it's not been instanced yet, and we're going to say load asset blocking. And what this will do is it will generate the asset. It will instance it so that we can actually use this. It will load it for us. So now this gives us an actual reference where we can get the name from it, but as such, it is just an object for now. So we need to cast it to what we need. So we're going to cast this to our data assets. And in our case, we have specifically melee or range, sorry. So we know it's that. So we're just going to plug this in. Otherwise, you could do for each of them that we need, or you could make the variable specific for what we need. So here, we now have a reference to our actual loaded data asset. So from here, we can say get weapon material, which we're going to need to actually set our static mesh here, set material to our weapon material that we selected. So like this. Now, by default, we can leave this empty because it's a soft reference, I believe. Just going to check if we play the game now. We don't get an error because it's a soft reference. So what we need to do here is now we can actually set the element. So we need to make sure to do that we can actually see our variable, because there's no point in selecting it here. There might be multiple weapons. So we want to select the I here to make it public and instance editable. So compile, and now we can actually select our data asset here. So let's make two. One for our fast and one for our slow. So if we play the game, it's going to load our two textures. We have orange, and we should have a grayish to the left once it's finished loading. For some reason, it's just still loading. Not sure why. It does have the right textures. No, anyway, it is selecting the two different materials, so it knows the difference. So that's what we wanted. Next, now that we have our pickup set up, or at least our actual our pickup weapon done, we're finished. So what we need to do first, one last thing, is we need to save this. So we're going to promote this to a variable, and this is the data asset ranged. And with that in mind, we can modify our add BP weapon gun. So let's go and open that in our first person blueprints. We're going to open the weapon component, and we can actually add that variable here. And we're going to make it exposed on spawn so that we can immediately reference it with no problem. So to do that, right click here, or left click, sorry, on the eye and on expose on spawn on the right. And we're going to look for our ranged data asset. And this time we do want an object reference because it's only going to be coming from an actual instance object anyway. So with this exposed, if we compile this, we can right click here, refresh the nodes, and it will appear right there. We'll get our range data here, plug it in, and with it now, if we pick up the weapon, we will know what the weapon is called. So to test that, we can check on begin play right here. We'll put a print, and actually no, we'll put a print text because we have a text value. So from here, get our new variable, we will say get name, and we can plug this name in here. And normally if we pick up our weapon, it will have the specific name we gave it. So here will be slow. Now here it's not going to pick up, or at least it shouldn't because we already have one equipped. So let's go through that again. On the right, we have our slow weapon, and on the left, if we go and pick up now, we have the fast weapon. So those are the two weapons that we made, no issues there. And so because of how this is set up, we have all the information we need from our data assets right here. So it's all in one spot, and we can get access to it without a problem. So let's just open this up so we know how it works. So there we go. So we have our range. So we have our range, we have our fire rate, we have our magazine, we have max ammo. So the first thing we want to do is just like what we did here. We want to set the material. So we're going to pretty much just copy this from here to here, and we'll just let it be used on self because this is a static mesh. So if we plug this in and we get our new variable, because that's the same reference, if we play and we pick up this weapon, it will be orange. If we pick up this one, it'll be the other color. Let's see. So if we pick this one up, and the material's still not loading, but it does know that it's a different material. So now let's actually, you know what, we'll just quickly change that material to see why it does that. That way we have another material so we can test it. And now we have orange, you have green. There we go. So now it's working. Now there's no problem. So if we select it, pick it up, we have the green color. Now, what we can do to test this a bit further now that we have our material set, what we can do here is we're going to put our delay, and this is so that we can test if we can keep shooting. So what we want to check is if our fire rate, once that fire rate has passed, what we will do is we will check if we can repeat this action. So to do that, we're going to get a branch, and we want to check whether the key is still down. In this case, the key is shoot. So what we'll do is from our branch, we will call IA shoot, and we'll look for the enhanced action values, and this will be true if ever we are pressing the key and false if we are not. So what this means is whenever we try and shoot, it will go and shoot. Now, one thing I'm actually going to remove here is the play sound, because otherwise it's going to destroy my ears. So I'm just going to remove that ahead of time, and we'll compile. And so now on true, what we want to do is we will want to execute this again. So just to make things more readable, we'll make a custom event called shoot, and we'll remove that and say on triggered shoot. There we go, like this. And we will call shoot right here on true. And so normally what this means is if we have the slow weapon, we will fire a lot slower than if we have the other one, or we won't fire at all apparently. After a bit of testing, I'm still not sure what's happening, but the problem seems to be coming from the fact that the action isn't being called from here, but is only being allowed to be called from the player character, which is not usual. Normally it should work. So if it's working for you, just stick with it in the actual weapon component blueprint. But in my case, I'm gonna just have to add shoot here, and I'm going to check if we have rifle. I'm going to get components by class, because I need to get a reference to the actual component itself, which is going to be a skeletal mesh component. And normally this should be a BP. Oh no, sorry, I should be getting BP weapon simply. And we're just going to look in self if we have this component. If we do, I'm going to be calling the shoot function that we just made on started, I believe. So let's see if that worked. And just for testing purposes, I re-put the sound, which is a terrible idea. I'm just going to remove that so that I don't go deaf. Now, normally, if we, there we go. So the problem is, obviously, this is on triggered, so it's just going to be shooting continuously. So we're just going to modify that for a second and say on started instead. And so what that will mean is if we press, it will just shoot one bullet. If we hold, it will just shoot one. So what we're going to do is we're now going to go back in here on our shoot, and we're going to say if the fire rate has passed and if we are still trying to shoot, meaning we are holding the button, then we should shoot again. Now, I'm not sure if this will work due to how the shoot system works. I'm not sure why that is. So what we'll simply do is we're going to get a boolean here, which we'll call input down. Simply, we'll set it here on started to true, and we will clear it on cancelled or complete to false. So normally this should be called once we release, if I'm correct. So let's go and see. It only happens when we have a weapon in hand. Yeah, so it gets called on release, which is perfect. And inside of our BB component, we're not going to use this, but we're going to use our first person character and our input down. And if input down is true, then we will shoot again. So let's try that. If we hold this, there we go. So we can shoot quite quickly here. But now if we go and select our second one here, so the slow one, it'll be a lot slower to do its different shots. So this is very basically how you would set up data assets to work inside of UE4 and how they would work with weapons. Now, if you want to add something like durability, it's the exact same trick. You just make your data asset, make your reference here, set it here, load that reference by using the load asset blocking, convert it to whatever you need. In the case here, we needed a ranged weapon. In the other case of melee with durability, you want to get a melee reference instead. Here you would be setting the skeletal mesh instead of just the material. And with that, you then have your visible item set up. And instead of doing a on hover set a weapon component, you would be adding a melee weapon component. You can do the same trick for transferring the data asset here, but you would need to add in our actor here, which we actually didn't do, which probably should have done in our weapon component. We should have something for the ammunition. So this would be current ammo. Let's actually do that right now so you see how it works. So for current ammo, we want to use a float, and current ammo on our spawn here, where we change the material, we're also going to get our magazine, and we're going to set that to current ammo. And every time we shoot, we're going to be taking that ammo and we're going to be decrementing it. So right here in shoot, we'll be doing that obviously when the bullet goes out, not during the fire rate. So here, increment, float, plug this in right here, plug that into the delay. And now what we want to check as well is if we can shoot. And to do that, very simply, is current ammo superior to 0 and is input down. So actually, sorry, this isn't correct. We should be doing this right here instead, because obviously if you click manually separately, you want to also obviously not shoot if you have no ammo. So as long as it's superior to 0, we can keep shooting. I put increment when it should be decrement, because we're losing ammo, not gaining ammo. There we go. So just plug this into the delay again, and we'll use the fast one this time instead. So this should be 15, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and there we go. So now we can't shoot anymore. Even if we click it multiple times, it won't shoot. And so that's how you do the exact same thing for your durability. If ever, for instance, you want to, let's say, in our case, we want to reload. Well, if we reload, we very simply want to get from here. We'll get our magazine again, and we will just simply set that to current ammo. That's all. And so this is kind of what you do for everything really related to data assets. You just want to make sure that you build kind of a framework around it. And that can sometimes be very difficult, especially when working on larger projects. You really have to think ahead and plan for kind of everything you could potentially encounter, so that later you have as little work to do as possible. And so in this case, it is having our magazine and all that set in stone with our data assets, and just having a modifiable one in the actors that actually get modified. So I hope this video covered everything you wanted to know about data assets and how you would apply them to a weapon system. Although I'm sorry we didn't cover melee, but melee is exactly the same thing to this one. It's exact same to range, the only difference being that instead of having an animation that's already set up in the first person, we just would have an animation where the player swipes in front of him, and instead of having a gun in his hand, we would just attach a static mesh or a skeletal mesh of a sword. The trick would be the exact same. So I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned a lot, or even a bit. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.